Hi, Erika Galentin from Sovereignty Herbs, and I'm here on this beautiful, beautiful April day to share with you one of my favorite ways of propagating plants in my gardens. There are a variety of ways you can propagate plants. You can propagate by seed, you can propagate by a process called layering, but what I wanted to show you today was the process of taking cuttings and creating a whole new plant from a piece of a plant that you've cut off. It's really quite an enjoyable process, actually. To me, it's one of those, taking cuttings and growing plants from cuttings is almost like an art form, part of the art of horticulture, which I really, really, really enjoy. You also probably read about taking cuttings as cloning, which it is. It's one of the most amazing things about the plant kingdom, where you can go and dismember a plant and stick it in soil and it grows a whole new root system and a whole new individual plant is created from that. So we're going to take advantage of nature's way in that regard today, and I'm going to take you out and about in the gardens, show you some of the tools I use, some of the supplies I use, and just give you some tips for growing successful cuttings in your own gardens. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, so first things first, we need to go through a very short list of tools and supplies that you're going to need in order to create successful cuttings. The first thing is the tool that you're going to use to take the cuttings. So these are just standard garden pruners, my favorite tool in the world. You can also use, kitchen scissors, or some people like sewing scissors. The real key is that you want to make sure that they're sharp, really, really sharp. And the reason why is that when we go to take the cutting, we want a really clean cut. We don't want a cut that's all scraggly or ripped or torn. And the reason why is that you're going to get more successful root development if you have that clean surface to work with on the bottom of the cutting, rather than something that's all raggedy and ripped apart. Because there's no consistent surface there. And it can also lead to, other issues such as the onset of rot and all the other things that are going to make your cuttings unsuccessful. So nice sharp tool is needed. The second thing you're going to need is a potting soil or some sort of growing medium to put the cuttings into as you are developing the root system. There's so many different kinds of potting soils available, and planting or cutting mediums available. One of the things that I'm going to say is that I have found the most success using a potting soil that is devoid of all of the bells and whistles that you can normally get in potting soil. So for example, nowadays they're putting in all kinds of built-in fertilizers, those moisture beads, and all different kinds of surfactants, which really help the peat take up moisture and hold on to that moisture. All of these added added elements to potting soil can be really great when you're working with developed potted plants. But when we're working with cuttings, sometimes these extra elements like the moisture beads or the fertilizers or the surfactants can actually end up creating an environment inside of the cutting space that adds to rot and mold and all of these other things that are going to destroy your cuttings. So I think a really simple potting soil, no bells and whistles, is a really great starting place. The third thing I'll say is a lot of people talk about using a rooting hormone when you go to do any kind of cuttings. And while I find that rooting hormone can be really, really helpful for, really like hard material, woody plants, these kinds of things that really need an extra hormonal nudge to get their roots going. When we're working with herbaceous cuttings like we are going to be today, it's not really that necessary. I've been taught and I have found that actually using a rooting hormone with herbaceous cuttings is detrimental to the cuttings, in as much as that most of the time they put the rooting hormone in a powder. And you dip your cutting in that powder, you put your powder in your potting soil with your cutting, and it's just yet another way for mold and rot to set in. So You don't need rooting hormone to do herbaceous cuttings, believe it or not. It's absolutely fine. So the last thing that you're gonna need, so we've got our tools, right? We got our scissors or our pruners. We've got our potting soil, which is devoid of all the bells and whistles. We don't need any rooting hormone. And last but not least, you're going to need container for the cuttings to go into. You have a ton of options here. The world is your oyster. And there's a few things that, I think you should consider when you're thinking about what you're going to put your cuttings into. So one of the things you can use, and I've used before, and it works just fine, are these paper egg curtains. Yeah. And, when you're doing cuttings, it's really good to make sure that each individual cutting has its own space. I think that that's a really good thing to consider. The reason why is because you can control that environment a little bit better than if they were all shoved in the same pot, so to speak. So it's always good to have something that's got individual cells for each cutting, so you can have that kind of isolated environment for each cutting. If you are going to use something like this egg carton here, there's a few things to keep in mind. First and foremost, you're going to need to cut a hole in the bottom of each of these cells. I've done that right here. See that there? In order to allow the moisture to drain. One of the drawbacks to using something like this is that it holds on to a lot of water, and too much water can actually cause your cuttings to deteriorate. So, so make sure if you're going to use the egg curtains, you just, punch some holes in the bottom of them. Another drawback, I think, to using the egg cartons is the fact that they're relatively shallow in depth. And I think for the most part, for myself, my preference is to have a little bit more depth to each cell, so I can have a little bit more of a substantial cutting that goes into that cell. So, but these can work just fine. You don't need to do anything fancy other than maybe poke some holes in the bottom. What I tend to use and what I like a lot are these guys. And yes, they're plastic, and they're not like super strong plastic, but they are reusable. So, I have used the same these same plug cells, over and over and over and over, season after season after season, and eventually, yes, they do poop out. But I think they're really great. I like them because they are reusable. I can wash them, I can disinfect them, and get them ready for a new season. And I also really like the depth. You can see the depth there. That's a really good thumb's worth of depth. And I think that allows for a really good substantial cutting. So you can use these. These usually come in, kind of a large tray that you can break apart into these 6-packs. And they're usually available at your local plant place or hardware store. We've got a really great place here in Athens, Ohio called White's Mill, and they have them there. So these are really, really great. I really like these a lot. So now that we have all of our supplies and tools at hand, let's get prepared to go take some cuttings. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just start with loading up the plug tray with soil, with potting soil, potting medium. And it's really obviously very simple, straightforward process. You just basically take it and make sure that you've got enough to fill up all the cells, which I may or may not have in my little pile here. So one of the things I like to do, is I like to go through and make sure any clumps are broken up, which, can kind of make for a difficult growing environment. Like to pull out the sticks you find. Try to keep it the consistency homogeneous as much as possible. And then from there, I like to just kind of gently go over it with my hand, get it all even, just like so. And you don't want to, one of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to sit there and like press the soil in, right? You don't want to compact it down with pressing. Let's see if I can just grab a little bit extra here for this last cell. But it is always a good idea to just give it a good tap. And giving it a good tap on the ground or the surface just allows that potting soil to settle in really well without compacting it. So from here, now that we've got our cell trays filled, they look good. They've been tapped, so they're nice and even and settled in there. We're going to go ahead and water this in. You have to let it sit. So they're pretty well watered through. They're kind of dripping through the bottom. See that? You want a nice good dripping through the bottom. And they're nice and kind of wet. What you don't want to do is, again, press on any of this yet. You just want to kind of leave it as is. And these cells now are ready to receive their cuttings. So let's go get some cuttings. So one of the things about taking successful cuttings or learning how to propagate through cuttings is choosing the plant material that you're going to try to propagate in this way. And not all plants take to doing cuttings with the same verve. You know, some plants are much more difficult or slower to develop a root system. And the longer they're sitting in those plug trays, you know, the more likely it is that they're going to end up with you know, some sort of rotting or whatnot. So, you know, generally speaking, when you're starting off cuttings, if you're not used to doing it or if you've not done it before, is to start with the, you know, the nice, good herbaceous, fleshy plant material like we've got here. So this is a native mint. This is a mountain mint, short-toothed mountain mint, Pycnanthemum muticum. It's a wonderful native mint. The bees and native pollinators go nuts over it. And it's also just a really beautiful plant to have in your landscape. So this species particular takes very, very easy to cuttings, as does its neighbor here, Monarda fistulosa. So this is the purple bee balm, also in the mint family. And really, if you're very new to taking cuttings, it's a really good idea to kind of start with plants in that plant family, specifically the herbaceous ones. It can be a little bit more difficult with woody mints. So for example, a nice old woody sage or old woody rosemary or old woody lavender, while they can do cuttings very, very well, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to learn if you're using those more kind of slow growing species. So when choosing where to actually make the cut, you know, remembering that, for example, with the trays that I'm using, they're about a thumb deep. So I want to make sure that when I'm going after the stem, that I have at least a thumb's deep worth of length. It's hard to show with one hand there. So, you know, I'm going to be looking at not cutting it all the way at the top, not cutting it even here necessarily, but I might consider actually cutting it down here at this bottom part here. And that way, you know, I definitely have enough plant material to work with. It's always best, especially with the members of the mint family, to take your cutting right above the leaf axils. So you just kind of go in and make a nice good clean snip. I always do it on an angle. And so there it is right there. That is a really good specimen for making a cutting. All right, so now that we have all of our cuttings collected and our plug trays are ready to go, they're filled and watered in, we're going to go ahead and put the cuttings in. Just a few things that I wanted to note before you get going with all of this is there are two things that are going to really destroy your cutting success. And the first thing is too much heat and too much light. So here I am standing in my little propagation greenhouse. When I go to take the cuttings and put the cuttings into these plug trays, I'm going to want to make sure that I'm not in here where it's really hot and very sunny, because there's going to be no root system in these cuttings, and too much heat and sun is going to make them wilt and then perish. So you want to make sure that you're somewhere that's cool and in the shade. And also when you're done and you have your cuttings all set to go and they're already in here, that you put them somewhere that's in the shade, you know, at least until you start to see a root system develop. You know, as I mentioned before, too much light is actually going to be detrimental to the success of the cuttings. So just, you know, put the cuttings, take care of the cuttings in the shade, leave them in the shade until you start to get a root system. The other thing that's going to actually be detrimental to the success of your cuttings is too much moisture or not enough moisture. So, you know, one of the things that you need to make sure of when you're propagating plants this way is that you're keeping an eye on the moisture levels. You don't want these like sitting and soaking in water. That's not going to be good. You know, you can increase the opportunities for, you know, rot and fungus and all these other things. So you don't want them to be too wet, but if you let them dry out, they're also going to then wilt and then die. So not too much sun, not too much heat, and not too much moisture, and you should be pretty much ready to go. So let's go put the cuttings in the plugs. Okay, so now that I have my kind of hardy cuttings, it's time to plug them into the plug trays. And so this is where, you know, you need to do a little bit of trimming, simply because, you know, the plant itself doesn't have obviously a root system yet, and we're trying to encourage a root system. But we want to make sure that it doesn't desiccate or wilt and die before the plant has the opportunity to develop that root system. So part of the process here is actually about removing some of the surface of the plant material that will, you know, transpire moisture. So really that's about taking off extemporaneous leaves and, you know, even trimming back some of the existing leaves. We still want it to photosynthesize, but we don't want it to have so much foliage that it kind of sucks itself dry, so to speak. So that's what we're going to do now. So I've got my hardy cutting here, and this beautiful hardy cutting here. Yep. And I'm really just going to take these two bottom leaves off, just pinch them off, so to speak. Pinching, pinching. And then you see I've got, it looks like 1, 2, 3 developed sets of leaves. And so I'm going to go ahead and instead of totally pinching these off, these bottom ones, which I could do if I wanted to, I'm actually just going to trim and cut off half of these here. So, you know, I'm not taking a whole bunch of the leaf. I'm not taking the whole leaf off. I'm just kind of cutting half of it off. I think that'll do. So it ends up looking like that. So, and then, you know, just the other thing too is you want to make sure that you don't have too much stem, because too much stem, it's, you know, not very supportive structure for this process. But you also don't want it to be too short either, again, because you're going to lose the opportunity to grow a decent root system. And so, you know, I always say with the length of it, here's my plug trays, should probably be about the same as the plug tray. I like to make sure that it's not totally touching the bottom of the plug itself, but, you know, kind of close enough. So about that long. Yeah. Got my handy little stick here. Sticks are awesome tools for propagating plants. I also like to use pens and pencils sometimes. These are the official instruments of the trade. So I make a little hole just so I'm not like smushing this when I'm shoving it in, and I just pop it right in like so. Tighten up that soil by gently pressing. So I'm going to press around and voila. It's as easy as that. Well, thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you learned something new, and you know, that you've got more confidence now to kind of go out and start propagating plants in your gardens through cuttings. That's my hope anyway. For those of you who are on Facebook and Instagram, you can follow me there at Sovereignty Herbs, as well as at The Medicine Gardener. And as always, I look forward to sharing more and more about my plant adventures with you. Feel free to leave a comment about you know, the video, whether you liked it or didn't like it. I always look forward to everybody's feedback. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a great week. I am off to go put these in the shade.